Hello, welcome to Salisbury Cathedral's reflection for today, Friday the 26th of June. I'm Robert Titley, the Cathedral's Canon Treasurer. These past months have really given us, if ever we needed it, a proper sense of the proportion of things. If the ravages of the virus haven't come very close to your home, the stories of it being visited upon others will have thrown the troubles and setbacks of your life, as it has mine, into a certain light. The health snatched away, the lives ended, the livelihoods disrupted, place the other more workaday concerns of life in their proper size. But we mustn't forget the other stuff. Not matters of life and death, perhaps, but nevertheless, things that are really very, very important. The countless weddings that have had to be put off for next year. When they come, they will be days of joy, but it's still immensely sad that two people who want to spend the rest of their lives together as married partners can't do it now and have to do it later. On Wednesday, I was on duty very happily at the cathedral, welcoming people now that we're open for what is officially described as supervised individual prayer. And I was talking to someone who had been expected to be ordained this weekend, the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, or Petertide as the church calls it, the time of the year when most people are ordained. Now, it's not a complete catastrophe. She will be ordained with her colleagues in September, but it was still a poignant moment. Here was someone who had offered herself to God, and this was the moment when the church would have endorsed and celebrated that, and now that moment has been postponed. Now, it's the impending feast of Petertide that prompted my colleague, Nick, our dean, earlier this week to offer a very widely appreciated reflection about his own story of vocation, because this coming weekend will see the 20th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood. And that got me thinking about my own story of vocation, because this weekend will see the 35th anniversary of my ordination as a deacon. Not that there's any competition, not that anyone's counting, you understand. But it did make me think about the ways in which Dean Nick's story and mine are both similar and different. Like him, I can look back on having very good experience of life in the church as a child and as a young person. In my case, it was a very good Methodist church in the outer suburbia of London. Like him, I too can point to a vocation experience with a capital V and a capital E. Some people have a conversion experience they can talk about, a moment in life when they said, Jesus, come into my life, or when they say yes to God, or however they choose to describe it. I've never had that moment of conversion to point to, but I do have a vocation moment, as Dean Nick described for himself. In my case, I suppose it began as a 19-year-old when the minister of the church asked me if I had thought of offering for the ministry, an idea I instantly dismissed, only for my dad to say the same thing about a fortnight later. And I then thought, oh God, this is probably what I'm supposed to do. And it was definitely not the thing I wanted to do. I had quite other plans. There then followed 3 years as a student of considering and repeatedly rejecting the idea, until a moment came when one Saturday evening I was quite filled up, palpably filled up, with a sense that that was what God wanted me to do. I even wrote down the date in a holy book I was reading at the time, 18th of March 1978. That was the moment when I was sure God wanted me to be ordained, and at that moment I wanted to be ordained too. It was a moment of homecoming in a way, a moment of great relief. I immediately went and told a friend what had happened, and he was very kind and very glad, but answered in words that more or less were saying, well, tell me something I don't know. He'd seen it coming quite a while before. The difference, I think, is that Dean Nick's story was one of inner conviction, which was then confirmed by other people. For me, it was the other way around. It was people suggesting it to me and my insides catching up later on. And as I heard other people's stories of vocation over the years, I've become convinced of the remarkable creativity of God, in that there are no two stories that are exactly the same. Other people's stories will be much less decisive than mine, but no less real. They talk less of a flashbulb going off and rather more of a photograph gradually developing in a dark room from negative to positive. And I realise that if you're younger than a certain age, you will have no idea what that image is referring to. God does not do vocation off the shelf. There is no single way to be called by God. God is endlessly honouring of our differences, our uniqueness. That's a common theme in these very different stories. And another common theme is this, that God never acts as a Pied Piper, seducing people's souls and robbing them of freedom to choose. God does not manipulate when God calls people. God does not overwhelm people with omnipotence. It's always done in a way, if it's an authentic sense of God's call, that leaves you or me free to choose. Now, why talk about this stuff again in the space of 3 or 4 days? Aren't there enough other things in the world clamouring for our attention to try and make sense of in the light of God? Only today on the news, there are 3 more stabbings, this time in Glasgow. Why, again, talk about people being called to be vicars in what might seem a rather self-indulgent way? Well, my point is that these stories of vocation point to how I believe God almost all the time chooses to work in our world, a world that contains ghastly cruelty as well as great kindness. God chooses to work in a way that does not manipulate the natural world or manipulate human beings, overwhelming us with omnipotence. God chooses instead to work by prompting, challenging, nudging, calling the human heart, and doing it in a way that leaves us free to ignore or even actively to reject, so that we are never robbed of our autonomy, our freedom to say yes or to say no. Vocation for me is the heart of the Christian life. I can't think of any part of the life of faith that is not connected to responding to God's call. And there's no more important thing that you and I can do in the space of each 24 hours than simply this, to clear some space in life, to create some stillness in which you can say to God again, here I am, what are you asking of me? Usually, probably, when you say that, nothing will happen, nothing that you notice, but it creates the space for something to happen. And indeed, with God, for whom nothing is impossible, it's clearing space for anything to happen. If I say, here I am, feeling happy, well, that happiness can bubble over into a prayer of thanksgiving. If I say, here I am, feeling guilty, that guilt can be galvanized into a prayer of confession. I'm sorry. And that can lead to forgiveness and a renewed will to try and put things right, if that's possible. Here I am feeling inadequate. Well, that ghastly, paralyzing feeling of not being up to it can be turned inside out into a prayer for help, which can lead you to receiving the things that you need to get through that particular challenge. Here am I really worried, and that nag of anxiety can also have a door opened upon it and become a prayer for the person or the cause that is causing you to be so anxious, simply because you care about them as much as you do. Listening for God's call. No more important thing to do today, to do now, indeed. And sometimes the answer, when it comes, will be as palpable as a voice like mine speaking to you now. Much, much more often, it will be something subtler and more easily missed, unless we really give time to paying attention to it. The answer that comes sometimes will be a call about what to do with this moment, with the next hour of your life. Sometimes the answer that comes will be a call about what to do with the rest of your life. And so let us now try to create that pool of stillness, to present ourselves to God and say, here I am, and see what God might do when that space and that stillness is put in God's hands. So if you wish, do join me in prayer. Here I am, Lord, here we are. As you called your disciples, call us now. Open our ears to listen to your calling. Open our eyes to see you. Open our hearts to your love. Help us to hear you, to experience your presence with us, and to love you. And in loving you, help us to serve you, our servant King. Amen. Thank you very much for your time, and may God be with you wherever it is that God is leading you upon your path of faith and vocation.